Welcome to Starbound. If you're tired of AI-generated slop and want real human storytelling, please subscribe to support this channel. My name's Aaron. I'll be your narrator. Let's get into the story. The heavy prisoner transport vessel, the Tether, sheared through the frontier world's primordial western jungle canopy. Massive, ancient trees splintered against the reinforced hull, sending shockwaves vibrating through the ship's internal superstructure. The shrieking of tearing metal deafened the lower decks. Warning klaxons blared in a disjointed, overlapping rhythm. Their harsh electronic wails struggled to compete with the sheer roar of atmospheric friction and crushing timber. Inside the engineering bay, the local grav grid inverted instantly. Kieran slammed into his crash harness as the bay's damaged plates pulled him toward the ceiling. The heavy canvas straps bit deep into his collarbone and waist, arresting his momentum just as the ship struck the swamp below. The final impact threw the entire vessel forward, burying the bow deep into the caustic, bubbling mire. The ship shuddered wildly, hull plates buckling under the pressure, before grinding to a sickening tilted halt. Kieran hung upside down in his harness. Blood pooled in his head, creating a throbbing pressure behind his eyes as a warm trickle ran from his nose into his messy brown hair. Across the narrow bay, the primary diagnostic console ruptured. Arcs of raw current whipped across the grated deck plating, igniting a pool of leaked polyresin coolant. The chemical fire surged, bathing the cramped space in erratic flares. Kieran held his tongue, pressing his shoulders firmly against his restraints. He took a slow, measured breath, coughing as the burning synthetic fluid coated his throat. He blinked the blood out of his left eye and studied the electrical fire. "The rupture severed the primary coolant line," Kieran said, forcing his words evenly through the inverted pressure in his lungs. "We have 58 seconds before those flames reach the secondary fuel cells." Jonas, his twin brother, unbuckled his own harness with a sharp metallic click. He dropped to the slanting ceiling, now serving as their floor, and walked over to Kieran. Grease and soot smeared Jonas's coveralls. He kept his stance braced against the tilt, reaching into his chest pocket, withdrew a small medical penlight and clicked it on. "Keep your eyes open," Jonas instructed. He swept the harsh white beam across Kieran's pupils, watching the irises contract. He nodded once, satisfied, and clicked the light off. "Pupillary response is normal. You sustained only minor head trauma," Jonas stated, keeping his tone level. He reached up and unlatched the heavy primary buckle on Kieran's chest plate. "Brace yourself. I'm dropping you." Kieran caught his own weight on his forearms as the harness released, dropping heavily onto the inverted ceiling panels. He groaned, rolled his shoulders to alleviate the strain, and grabbed his heavy tool belt from the nearby bulkhead bracket. "Good to know my brain works," Kieran muttered, pulling a dense fire suppressant canister from its bracket. He aimed the nozzle at the sparking console and squeezed the trigger. Thick white foam blasted over the ruptured lines, smothering the chemical fire. "Considering we just rode a 2,000-ton iron brick into a swamp, our sanity remains debatable." Jonas offered a tight smile. He picked up his medical diagnostic tablet, swiping a smear of coolant off the cracked screen. "The impact vector was severe. The environmental sensors are throwing error codes. External pressure is spiking. The mire is pulling us under." "In that case, we need to get to the bridge," Kieran said, wiping the blood from his forehead with the back of his grease-stained glove. He checked the charge on his portable plasma torch and slotted it into his hip rig. "If we are sinking, the cell blocks on the lower decks are flooding." Captain Sina braced her tall, rigid frame against the bridge's tilted tactical plotting table. Sina belonged to a species that ordered their entire society around strict military castes. Her calcified dermal plating, naturally a vibrant oxidized green, had faded to a chalky gray in the crash's aftermath. She widened her stance to maintain balance against the deck's severe 30-degree list. She gripped the console's edges, pressing her knuckles hard against the glass. Dark, viscous mud covered the primary viewport's massive slab of transparent plasteel. The swamp water bubbled aggressively as acidic compounds within the soil reacted with the ship's heated outer hull.
"Reroute auxiliary power to the containment field generators," Cena commanded, projecting a clipped formal bark. "Seal bulkheads 2 through 6. Enforce Standard Lockdown Protocol 41-A. Ensure the prisoners remain secured." The automated systems chirped a series of staccato warnings. The ship's central intelligence, fractured by the impact, responded with scattered data points. Hull integrity failing, hydrostatic pressure exceeding structural tolerance, lower deck flooding imminent. The bridge doors retracted with a metallic groan. Kieran and Jonas stepped onto the command deck, navigating the severe tilt with steady balance. Kieran walked directly to the tactical console, ignoring Cena's rigid glare, and tapped the atmospheric readouts.
"Captain, you need to release the magnetic locks on the lower cell blocks right now,"
Kieran stated.
"The hydrostatic pressure on the ventral hull is exceeding the plating's tensile shear limit. The hull will breach."
Cena turned her sharp, angular face toward the human engineer, squinting her primary optics. "Protocol 41-A indicates that in the event of a catastrophic grounding, all high-security inmates must remain in their designated containment cells to prevent hostile dispersal. I will maintain the security of this vessel."
"This vessel is a tomb,"
Kieran countered, pointing his grease-stained glove at the viewport.
"Look at the density of that fluid. It is highly corrosive and incredibly heavy. When the hull buckles, the water will flood the lower decks in seconds. The automated cell doors will short out. Every single prisoner down there will drown inside their cages."
"They are convicted criminals. Some of them are murderers," Cena replied, stiffening her jaw. She overrode a flashing warning light on her console, manually locking the containment doors. "I am responsible for their secure transport. Releasing them into an uncontrolled environment directly violates standard operating procedure." Jonas stepped forward and spoke with a quiet, grounding gravity.
"Captain, a sentence of incarceration is a temporary hold, a promise of transport. Leaving them locked inside converts that sentence to an execution. The structural buckling point arrives in well under 2 minutes."
A violent shiver racked Cena's frame. Her rigid worldview, sculpted by years of absolute adherence to military and penal law, violently rejected the situation's chaos. The ship was failing, and the prisoners posed a severe threat. Every variable existed outside her control. She looked at the pair of humans. Grime, bruises, and blood layered their skin. The crash stripped them of protocol safety, yet they maintained their composure. She gripped the console tighter, her plated fingertips scoring the metal. She looked at Kieran, her armor rattling as a deep distress took hold. "How do you function?" Cena asked, the question slipping through her strict facade. She forced her words into a harsh whisper. "Your species, you are incredibly soft. You rely on single fragile organs. You face certain death with entirely steady hands. What terrifies humans?" Kieran paused his work on the console. He looked down at his own hands. The fine motor tremor of adrenaline and deep, primal terror vibrated through his muscles. He clenched his fists, forcing the shaking to stop, and looked directly at the alien captain. He tilted his head and said, "Everything. Terror consumes us completely right now. We act anyway." Cena shuddered. The concept defied her understanding. To her species, fear served as a biological override, a signal to retreat, to hold still, or to rely entirely on established doctrine. Functioning through paralyzing dread, choosing to act while the nervous system demanded a halt, felt completely unnatural. It was a paradox. "I must keep the cells locked," Cena whispered, shivering as she spoke. "The manual states—" "Burn the manual," Kieran interrupted. Kieran sprinted toward the bridge's rear maintenance hatch. He grabbed his portable plasma torch from his hip rig. Registering the battery pack's heavy weight, he threw open the hatch and slid down the access ladder, his boots hitting the mid-deck's grated floor with a heavy clang. Jonas shadowed him step for step. Ankle-deep water already flooded the mid-level. The dark fluid released thick yellow vapor that burned the back of Kieran's throat. It bubbled upon touching the metal floor, the mild acidity already eating away at the paint. Kieran waded through the rising water toward the massive primary bulkhead door separating the mid-level from the lower cell blocks. The reinforced steel door held tight, the heavy magnetic latches glowing a solid, locking crimson. Through the thick metal, frantic prisoner commotion echoed in the corridor. Heavy fists pounded against the doors. Inmates screamed as the water surged into their cells. "Captain Cena locked the master relay," Jonas noted, standing beside Kieran and examining the dense electronic locking mechanism embedded in the bulkhead. "Firmware encrypts the digital bypass. Slicing it requires an hour." "Time is much shorter than that," Kieran said. "We have seconds before the hull folds." He thumbed the ignition switch on the plasma torch. The device hummed loudly, a deep pneumatic whine vibrating through Kieran's forearms. A blade of superheated concentrated plasma roared to life, casting a stark white flare across the dark corridor. The heat radiating from the torch baked the sweat onto Kieran's face. He stepped up to the bulkhead and pressed the energy blade's searing tip directly against the master lock relay housing. The metal squealed. A shower of white-hot sparks erupted outward, splashing into the murky water around their boots and flash-boiling the surface. Kieran locked his jaw, leaning his entire body weight into the heavy tool. The plasma cut through the reinforced housing, melting the thick plating and steel into glowing, dripping slag. Radiant heat baked his palms through the leather. He maintained the pressure. He gripped the handle tight, his muscles burning with the effort, actively fighting the urge to drop the tool and flee. "Almost," Kieran grunted, adjusting his angle to sever the primary power feed inside the mechanism. A loud, groaning crunch echoed through the ship. The hull buckled. The pressure from the swamp outside crushed the lower deck bulkheads inward. The water at their feet surged, rising rapidly to their knees. Kieran twisted the torch, driving it deep into the relay's core. The thick copper power cables inside flashed and vaporized. The magnetic latches disengaged with a series of heavy, resounding thuds. The crimson lights above the door went dark, yielding to the emergency release's dull amber. "Done!" Kieran shouted, shutting off the plasma torch and holstering it. He and Jonas grabbed the heavy manual release wheel on the bulkhead's face. They braced their boots against the slippery deck and hauled backward. The massive door groaned on its tracks. It ground against the warped frame for a second before sliding open. The immediate rush of water battered them. A massive wave of dark, acidic swamp fluid surged out from the lower deck, slamming into the pair of engineers and sweeping their legs out. Kieran choked down a mouthful of caustic fluid, gagging at the sting. He scrambled to his hands and knees, fighting the current as the flood level stabilized at waist height. Through the open bulkhead, the automated cell doors in the lower block, freed from the master lock, parted on their pneumatic tracks. The prisoners flooded into the corridor. The ship settled deeper into the mire. The upper mid-deck filled with the last 3 inmates who had reached the stairwells before the lower sections fully flooded. Most of the cell block had already gone under. Sardis, Bastos, and Namira shoved onto the limited strip of dry deck, coughing mire vapor from their lungs. Kieran and Jonas climbed up the stairs behind the mob, pulling themselves from the caustic tide. As they reached the staging platform, Captain Cena arrived from the bridge access corridor, her sidearm drawn, shifting her stance to physically block the advancing crowd. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Sardis, a wiry scavenger with slick dermal ridges and a serrated jaw, saw the captain. His jaw snapped open in an aggressive display. He had spent the entire transit trapped within a cage, watching the water rise, preparing to drown because of her adherence to protocol. Sardis let out a deafening rattling hiss and lunged across the deck, his hooked digits extended, aiming directly for Cena's throat. Cena raised her weapon. Her wrists shook. She paused for a fraction of a second. As Sardis lunged, a massive bulk of dense muscle intercepted him. Bastos, a heavy gravity worker with a wide low center of gravity and overlapping dermal calluses, slammed his huge shoulder into the wiry inmate. The impact echoed loudly through the metal chamber. The force threw Sardis backward, crashing hard against a row of supply lockers. Bastos stood between Sardis and the captain. His breathing rattled in his deep chest. A harsh, mechanical wheeze. Pale burn scars mapped his thick hide, mapping a violent past. He glared at the fallen inmate, curling his thick digits into tight fists.
She wields a firearm. You lack the mass to absorb a blast,
Bastos rumbled, his voice a low rumble that shook the deck plating.
She will kill you before you touch her. Death ends your escape.
Sardis scrambled to his feet, his jaw snapping aggressively.
She tried to drown us. I will peel her plating off.
Namira, a small canopy glider with membrane-webbed arms and a fragile, porous skeleton, pressed her back into a corner while Sardis and Bastos held their ground. Her wide, light-gathering pupils tracked every sudden movement, her chest heaving as she hyperventilated. Kieran tracked the shifting stances and bared teeth. Any violence down here would doom them all to drown. He drew his plasma torch, cranked the fuel mix to maximum, and aimed the nozzle straight up at the metal ceiling. He pulled the trigger. The torch ignited with a deafening explosive crack. The sudden blast of sound and searing white thermal bloom acted as an improvised stun grenade. Every alien in the room flinched, throwing their hands over their visual receptors and auditory canals. The sensory overload halted the advancing mob, snapping their attention toward the human engineer. Kieran released the trigger and stepped into the standoff center, standing between Bastos and Sardis. The torch sputtered in his grip. A crack split the emitter shroud where the flood had shock-cooled the metal, and the charge indicator on the handle blinked down to dead red. He kept the ruined tool raised anyway. He yanked open the staging area's nearest emergency locker and pulled out a bundle of standard-issue survival rations. He tossed the heavy foil packets onto the wet deck plating.
You can kill each other right now,
Kieran stated bluntly, projecting his words over the buckling hull's groans.
You can bleed out on this deck, or you can pick up a ration, consume the calories, and help us survive the acidic swamp currently swallowing us.
He pointed his torch at Sardis.
Revenge requires a pulse. You want to kill the captain? Fine. Survive the mire first.
The combatants held their ground. Only the hull's groaning and the rushing water below filled the space. The shared reality of starvation, exhaustion, and the rising flood overpowered the immediate desire for violence. Bastos unclenched his heavy digits. He reached down, picked up a ration packet, and ripped it open with his flat, grinding teeth. Sardis sneered, his dermal ridges flattening against his skull. He snatched a packet off the floor and backed away, keeping his gaze locked on Sina. The pragmatic necessity of survival forced a brittle, uneasy truce. Sina holstered her sidearm, locking her wrist to hide a persistent tremor. She stared at Kieran, her jaw tense. She snapped back into her formal posture, turned to the small console mounted on the staging area wall, and tapped the communications array diagnostic. The screen displayed static alongside crimson error codes.
The canopy impact pulverized the primary communication array on the hull,
Sina stated. She evaluated the battered survivors.
Command lost our signal coordinates. Rescue requires us to reach an outpost.
Namira let out a high-pitched, warbling keen, pressing her smooth, domed head against the wet wall.
The swamp surrounds us. The mud will dissolve the metal and consume us all.
We will survive today, Jonas stated. He walked over to the ship's secondary navigation console, a unit used for atmospheric descent tracking. He examined the readouts. The crash corrupted the software entirely, but the internal hardware remained intact. Jonas reached into his toolkit and pulled out a heavy pry bar. He jammed the steel bar into the console housing seam and wrenched it downward. The plastic casing snapped apart. Sina flinched at the deliberate destruction of ship property, but held her tongue. Jonas reached into the exposed wiring, threading his grip through the tangle of fiber optics. He grasped the primary optical sensor unit, a heavy cylindrical piece of hardware designed to pierce atmospheric interference. He severed the power feeds and physically ripped the sensor from its mount.
Kieran, take the front hatch. Open it. The water is rising, Jonas instructed.
He carried the heavy optic tube and his diagnostic tablet toward the upper airlock. Kieran grabbed the manual release lever for the external hatch and hauled it downward. The pressure seal popped, and the outer door blew wide. The environment rushed into the ship. The air outside blasted them with sweltering, wet heat. A thick yellow fog of vaporized sulfur and rotting biomass rolled through the opening, burning their throats. Through the opening, the dense jungle canopy dominated the horizon. Massive, twisting trees with dark, oily bark surrounded the sinking vessel. Jonas climbed up through the opening onto the ship's hull. The plating baked the soles of his boots. Puddles of acid ate into the metal, releasing thin trails of white smoke. He knelt on the slippery surface, placed the optical sensor down, and spliced the sensor base's fine fiber optic cables directly into the data port of his tablet.
What's he doing?
Bastos asked from below, stepping up behind Kieran to peer out into the hostile green gloom.
He routes the ship's sensor data into his tablet,
Kieran explained, holding the hatch open. Jonas rapidly inputted commands on the device display. He coded a brute force software patch, commanding the tablet's processor to translate the raw optical telemetry from the heavy sensor. The screen refreshed, displaying the surrounding environment's highly filtered infrared spectrum. Jonas adjusted the focal length, sweeping the lens across the dense jungle horizon. The trees acted as massive thermal heat sinks, displaying as dark, cold pillars on the monitor. He panned the lens higher, aiming toward the distant ridge of a massive valley.
"There,"
Jonas said. Kieran climbed up beside him and studied the display. Amidst the jungle canopy's cold dark blues, a distinct bright orange and white heat signature flared in the distance. It presented a highly structured geometric grid of thermal output.
"That indicates an industrial thermal signature,"
Kieran confirmed.
"A mining settlement. Deep core drilling produces that specific thermal output."
Jonas unplugged the sensor, leaving it on the hull, and pocketed his tablet. He looked down through the hatch at the waiting group.
"We have a destination," Jonas announced. "We must traverse the jungle entirely on foot to reach the valley ridge. That settlement provides our only viable shelter. We evacuate now, or we sink with the ship."
Kieran and Jonas stripped the nearest emergency locker before abandoning the ship. Loading a heavy utility bag and medical pack with ration bricks, tether cable, thermal cells, and field dressings, Sina took a pulse rifle and spare power cell from the bridge weapons rack. The transition from the sinking ship to the jungle floor introduced them immediately to the brutal ecosystem. The group abandoned the tether, sliding along the hull's port side and dropping into the surrounding tree roots. Behind them, the vessel groaned loudly as another bulkhead collapsed. The acidic swamp rapidly dissolved the remaining metal. They advanced a short distance before encountering their first barrier. A dense, towering wall of thick, pulsing vines blocked the canyon path between a pair of towering basalt spires. The vines grew in a sickly, translucent green mass. They writhed, constantly shifting their overlapping layers. Kieran stepped forward, observing the obstruction. He picked up a fallen branch and tossed it against the thickest vine. The moment the wood made contact, the vine violently contracted. A thick, clear sap oozed from the plant's pores, instantly dissolving the wood. The aggressive chemical reaction released a sharp, acrid cloud of burning carbon.
"Corrosive sap,"
Kieran noted, stepping back to avoid the vapor.
"Highly reactive."
Burn it!
Sardis demanded, pacing behind the group.
Use your fire tool!
"The plasma torch's emitter cracked in the flood," Kieran replied. "The last charge bought us that thermal flash in the staging area. All I have left are sealed thermal cells, and they only burn once you crack them open."
He pulled a dense power cell from his pack. He cracked the casing, exposing the reactive chemical core, and tossed it into the vine wall's center. He shielded his face, anticipating an explosive flash fire. The damp, saturated jungle atmosphere immediately choked the chemical reaction. The battery popped, sparked violently, and extinguished, smothered by the overwhelming humidity and the thick, wet vine sap.
"The ambient moisture suppresses combustion,"
Jonas assessed, surveying the surrounding rock walls.
"We must use this route. The vertical rock faces lack handholds and require specialized climbing gear."
Sardis bared his serrated teeth and backed away from the vines. Namira whimpered, her chest heaving as she pressed herself against a basalt spire. The jungle canopy trapped the sweltering heat, and the heavy footfalls of distant predators vibrated through the mud. Sina stepped to the group's leading edge. She studied the vines, then inspected her own hands. Thick, interlocking layers of calcified cartilage armored her forearms. Dense skeletal plates protected her underlying tissue.
The sap rapidly dissolves carbon and soft tissue,
Sina stated, assuming a firm command cadence.
My epidermis consists of high-density cartilage plates. I will endure the acid longer than your unarmored skin.
Sina stepped directly into the wall of vines. She raised her arms, pushing her forearms against the thickest, writhing stalks. The vines reacted aggressively. The corrosive sap sprayed across her plating, boiling the outer layer of her cartilage. Sina locked her jaw, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as the acid baked the tissue beneath her armor. She drove her boots into the mud, using her entire body weight to force the thick stalks apart, tearing a narrow, smoldering gap in the barrier.
Move!
Sina ordered through gritted teeth.
My armor is cracking!
Kieran moved first, ducking through the gap, dodging the dripping sap. Jonas followed, pulling the trembling Namira along with him. Namira stumbled, her lightweight frame making her clumsy in the thick mud. Sardis darted through next, keeping his eyes locked on the clearing ahead, focused solely on crossing the barrier. Sina remained in the breach, her muscles seized under the strain. The acid ate through the outer layers of her plating, the edges blackening and curling to expose the pink flesh underneath. She held the gap open, shielding the criminal's command assigned her to transport. Bastos stepped into the gap. He possessed too much width to fit through cleanly. The writhing vines dragged against his broad shoulders. The acid seared into his dense hide, burning deep into his old scars. Bastos let out a deep, booming roar as the chemicals dissolved his flesh. He pushed forward. He grabbed the heavy, thrashing vines near Sina's hands. He flexed his dense musculature, tearing the thick growth forcefully from its roots. He hauled the path wider, physically breaking the biological barrier apart.
Release them, Captain!
Bastos bellowed. Sina collapsed backward through the gap, landing hard in the mud. Acid smoked off Bastos's broad back as he shoved his way clear and dropped heavily beside her. The crossing exacted a severe toll. The acid scorched Sina's forearms, cracking and blackening her green dermal plates. She lay in the mud, panting, staring up at the massive, violent convict who had just absorbed chemical burns to pull her from the thicket. The shared agony established a sudden bridge between captor and captive.
Thank you,
Sina whispered, striping the rigid command cadence from her words. Bastos grunted, pushing himself up from the mud. He flicked a smoking clump of sap from his shoulder.
Save your gratitude, Warden. Just keep walking.
The ambient light faded rapidly as the local star dipped below the horizon. The thick canopy overhead obscured the sky, leaving the forest floor reliant on the faint bioluminescence of scattered spore clusters. Jonas established their camp near the base of a massive ancient tree, whose roots formed a natural, defensible alcove. They sat in a loose circle. Kieran sparked a small, smokeless fire using a chemical flare and dry rotwood scavenged from a dead log. The low flames cast stark, erratic illumination across their soot-stained faces. Bastos sat at the firelight's edge. Violent spasms racked the massive knuckles that had torn thick vines apart earlier. He clenched his fists, pressing them against his knees to force the shaking to stop, but the tremors continued. Severe adrenaline withdrawal and the vast open environment's psychological shock fueled his physical reaction. He drew ragged, uneven breaths into his deep chest. Jonas sat across the fire. He observed Bastos for several minutes, calculating the specific tremor frequency and the rapid expansion of Bastos's pupils. Jonas kept his silence. Jonas reached into his pack and withdrew his heavy survival knife. The carbon steel blade featured a matte finish and a freshly honed edge. Next, he picked up a dense, dark chunk of basil wood he had scavenged from the jungle floor earlier that day. Jonas stood, walked over to Bastos, and sat down in the dirt beside him. He placed the heavy knife and the block of timber directly into the alien's trembling palms. Bastos stared at the human, creasing his thick brow.
What is this?
Your central nervous system loops in a sympathetic overdrive, Jonas explained, keeping his tone measured and clinical. You are producing excess cortisol and adrenaline. You require an immediate physical outlet to expend it on. Your body is straining to locate an enemy to fight. You must ground the cognitive load. Jonas tapped the knife. Grip the handle. Place the edge against the grain. Push away from the chest. Shave the rough bark off the wood. Bastos gripped the small knife in his scarred hand. Haltingly, he brought the blade down against the dark wood. The severe tremors caused the steel to skip, scoring only a shallow line. Again, Jonas instructed. Focus entirely on the edge's angle. Drive the steel against the grain. Listen to the sound the cut makes. Bastos took a deep breath. He adjusted his grip, applying his immense strength with deliberate, focused control. He pushed the steel. A thin, curling ribbon of dark bark peeled away, falling to the dirt. The blade sheared the wood with a sharp scrape. Again, Jonas said. Bastos repeated the motion. Scrape. Once more. Scrape. The repetitive physical task demanded total focus. Bastos calculated the pressure, the angle, and the depth of every single cut. As he worked, the violent tremors in his knuckles smoothed out. The wood and steel's tactile feedback forced his nervous system to process the present moment, anchoring his attention wholly on the task. His ragged breathing settled into an even rhythm. Bastos sat by the low fire, steadily carving the rough block into a smooth cylinder, finding an unexpected sanctuary in the blade's simple friction. Jonas sat beside him, tracking the slowing heart rate and the relaxing musculature as his patient stabilized. The camp's fragile rest broke just before dawn. Sardis spent the night pacing the perimeter, fueling his own paranoia. He evaluated the exhausted group sleeping around the dying fire. He registered only their vulnerabilities: Sina's burned arms, Namira's trembling frailty, the fragile human engineers. Staying with this slow convoy sealed his fate. He possessed greater speed and lethal natural weapons, suiting him for solitary survival. As the first gray light filtered through the canopy, Sardis picked his way between the sleeping bodies. He crouched beside Jonas's pack, unclasped the heavy medical supply kit, and pulled it free. He slung the strap over his shoulder, turned toward the dense foliage, and bolted into the jungle on a rapid bipedal sprint. The snapping of branches woke the camp. Jonas sat up instantly, tracking the open, empty compartment on his pack. "He took the medical supplies," Jonas stated, already on his feet.
Leave him,
Sina said, standing up and stretching her burned arms.
he presents a massive liability. His absence improves our odds.
We require the coagulants and the thermal wraps to survive the night's temperature drop, Jonas countered, tightening his jaw. He stole the entire cache. Bastos grunted, picking up a heavy branch to use as a walking stick.
We hunt him down.
They tracked the snapped ferns in deep footprints Sardis left in the mud. The fugitive moved with fast, reckless speed, smashing directly through the underbrush. Shortly into their pursuit, Jonas planted his boots and froze. He raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. He knelt down, pressing his bare palm flat against the damp earth. Hold entirely still, Jonas whispered. Freeze your positions. What triggered the halt? Kieran asked, locking his joints. Rhythmic vibrations, Jonas replied, sweeping his gaze across the flat forest floor ahead. Deep in the soil, consistent frequency. A massive subterranean organism is burrowing beneath us, tracking the heavy erratic impacts of Sardis's sprint. Across a small clearing ahead, Sardis skidded to a halt. He looked back over his shoulder, baring his teeth as he confirmed his pursuers lagged behind. He adjusted the stolen med kit on his shoulder and marched proudly into the clearing center. The ground beneath him, instantly liquefied. The soil operated as an active trap. The earth collapsed inward with terrifying speed, revealing a massive subterranean funnel. Thick serrated roots lined the pit's edges, snapping and coiling to drag prey downward. At the funnel's center, a massive calcified pincer breached the surface, snapping at the air. A subterranean predator waited below, hunting entirely via seismic triggers. Sardis unleashed a high-pitched, rattling hiss of absolute terror. He sank to his waist in the shifting earth, his hooked digits scrambling desperately for purchase against the collapsing mud. "Help me!" Sardis shrieked. He thrashed wildly, kicking his legs and gouging the dirt, the violent movement funneling him faster toward the snapping pincers. Bastos roared and sprinted forward, tossing his heavy walking stick aside.
"Grab my arm!"
"Bastos, halt!" Jonas shouted, grabbing the massive alien's arm. "The soil structure is highly unstable. Entering the radius will trigger a wider collapse and guarantee a double fatality."
"I am pulling him out!"
Bastos yelled, shaking Jonas off. He dropped to his stomach at the solid ground's edge and extended his massive arm over the pit.
"Sardis, grab my hand! Cease your movement!"
Adrenaline completely overrode Sardis's rational thought. He registered the huge hand reaching for him, and processed the movement as a secondary attack. He lashed out, striking Bastos's outreached arm with his serrated jaw, tearing a shallow gash across the convict's forearm. Bastos recoiled with a grunt, pulling his bleeding arm back. That violent rejection sealed Sardis's fate. The earth gave way fully beneath him. The massive pincers snapped shut around his lower torso, crushing his ribs with a loud, wet snap. The ground swallowed him whole. Loose earth rapidly collapsed over the hole, filling the funnel entirely. Within seconds, the clearing smoothed over into a flat expanse of dirt. The creature dragged the stolen medkit deep into the subterranean tunnels along with its prey. The group stared at the freshly turned soil. The brutal event perfectly illustrated the local ecosystem's mechanics. Isolation attracted predators. Unchecked panic triggered the traps. Sardis struck the exact hand reaching to save him. Jonas walked forward, stepping deliberately on the exposed roots to avoid vibrating the soil, and studied the dirt where their supplies had vanished. He set his jaw. "Fear operates as a necessary proximity alarm," Jonas said, addressing the empty clearing. "Allowing the alarm to pilot the vessel guarantees a crash." The terrain elevated sharply as they approached the valley ridge's foothills. The dense jungle yielded to treacherous volcanic stone crags. They arrived at the edge of a massive deep ravine. At the bottom, 60 meters below, a fast-moving acidic river carved through the black stone, releasing plumes of toxic yellow steam into the air. A narrow, naturally occurring basalt ledge hugged the vertical cliff face, providing the only viable crossing. The pathway forced them to walk single file across crumbling, unstable rock. Sina went first, testing the path with her heavy boots before committing her weight. Namira stepped onto the ledge behind her. Namira reached the halfway point before her biology overloaded. Her canopy glider physiology evolved to launch from branches, relying on open air to deploy her membranes. As she looked down past her boots into the swirling, steaming abyss below, her brain registered the vertical expanse as a fatal trap. She panicked, her heart thumping so violently against her ribs that her entire torso vibrated. She slammed her back against the rough stone wall, dug her fingers into the rock, and locked her knees.
"The gap is too wide,"
Namira gasped, her chest heaving, staring at the opposing wall.
"My membranes. The updraft is wrong. The abyss is pulling me down."
Her muscles locked tight, forcing her into a state of rigid catatonia. Kieran waited with Jonas and Bastos on the near side. Namira locked against the rock face, displaying the exact posture of a central nervous system shutting down from adrenaline overload. Kieran stepped out onto the crumbling ledge. He edged his way out over the abyss, moving step by step until he stood directly in front of her. He pressed his back against the cliff face, matching her posture, turning his absolute focus away from the 60-meter drop at his heels. "Namira," Kieran said, forcing his tone into a slow, casual drawl. She stared straight down into the chasm.
Hey,
Kieran said. He reached out and placed his bare, grease-stained hand over her trembling, webbed fingers.
look at me. Focus right on my soft human face.
Haltingly, Namira dragged her gaze up from the drop and focused on his eyes.
Drowning terrifies me,
Kieran confessed.
When the water rushed into the ship's lower decks, when I cut that door open, I panicked hard enough to blur my vision. I choked on the vapor. Every instinct in my monkey brain screamed at me to drop the torch and run.
Namira blinked, her breathing hitching.
You stayed. You possess courage.
I remain completely terrified,
Kieran corrected.
I focused entirely on keeping my brother alive. I outvoted the terror. That defines courage, Namira. It requires locating a stronger motivation to override the panic.
He squeezed her hand tightly.
The abyss warrants your fear. The drop is lethal. You only need to cast a vote for taking a single stride. We will perform the physical mechanics of breathing together. Pull air into your lungs. Hold it. Push it out.
Kieran exaggerated a deep inhalation. Namira, anchoring to his steady rhythm and the physical contact, mirrored him. She drew a shaky breath.
Good.
Kieran smiled.
Now center your optics squarely on my shoulder, and prepare to slide the left foot forward exactly 3 inches.
He slid his foot, and she mirrored the motion.
Cast another vote,
Kieran said.
3 more inches.
Step by inch, anchored by the mechanical distraction of controlled breathing, Kieran led the paralyzed alien across the ledge. When Namira stepped onto solid ground on the far side, she collapsed to her knees, letting out a long, shuddering exhale. Kieran patted her shoulder, then retraced his steps across the precipice to join Jonas and Bastos. Sina observed the extraction from the far bank. She fully expected the human to leverage authority to demand compliance. Instead, he presented his own vulnerabilities as a bridge, overriding the panic through a shared admission of terror. A sharp geological crack echoed off the canyon walls. The ledge section Kieran and Namira had just traversed sheared away from the cliff face. A massive block of basalt plummeted into the abyss, crashing into the acidic river below and sending up a huge plume of steam. A massive gap, nearly 12 meters wide, separated Sina and Namira on the far side from the trio standing on the initial plateau. The collapse severed their path.
Well,
Kieran said, wiping rock dust from his knees.
That complicates the route.
The settlement's thermal bloom sits directly ahead, Jonas called across the gap, checking his diagnostic tablet. The ravine walls dictate we cross at this exact point. Kieran unslung his heavy utility bag and opened the main compartment. He extracted a spool of industrial monofilament tether cable tipped with a heavy expansion anchor clamp. He jammed the spool's steel axle into a forked basalt tooth at the plateau's edge and locked the housing in place.
I lost the pneumatic launcher in the wreck,
Kieran yelled over the canyon wind.
I still have the cable and clamp. The anchor is too heavy for a human to throw across that distance.
Bastos stepped to the gap's edge, calculating the drop, then looking across at Sina and Namira. He rolled his massive shoulders, the thick muscles shifting beneath his burned hide.
Throwing the clamp wastes time,
Bastos rumbled, projecting his deep voice across the distance.
I will throw the engineer.
Kieran stiffened, staring up at Bastos.
Repeat that proposition?
Your body mass is lower than the full spool,
Bastos stated.
If you hold the cable, my kinetic output can launch you across the gap. You secure the clamp on that side.
Kieran looked down at the chasm, then at the massive convict.
That ranks as the most dangerous proposition in my career. Human bones shatter upon high-velocity impact.
The physics translate perfectly, Jonas added, stepping up beside Bastos.
Bastos generates the kinetic output to clear the distance. A high-angle release arc ensures you land on the plateau. A steep release arc?
Kieran shouted, pitching his words up in alarm. Sina stepped forward on the gap's far rim. She studied Kieran, tracking the rapid breathing and the wide stance. She applied the exact lesson he had just taught Namira.
"Engineer Kieran,"
Sina called out, adopting a steady, grounding cadence.
"You are terrified. The fear is highly logical. Cast your vote and act anyway."
Kieran pressed his lips into a tight line. He looked at Namira, who raised her webbed hand in solidarity. He glanced at the heavy tether cable, drew a deep breath, and clipped the anchor clamp's carry loop to his heavy leather belt with a locking carabiner. He stepped up to the broken plateau's edge.
"All right, Bastos," Kieran yelled. "I am voting for the throw."
Bastos stepped forward and locked his massive fingers into the thick canvas webbing of Kieran's harness. With a deep grunt of exertion, Bastos pivoted his torso, engaged his massive leg muscles, and hurled the human engineer across the 12-meter gap. Kieran rode the ballistic arc over the chasm. The wind roared in his ears as the abyss passed directly beneath his boots. He locked his jaw, keeping his eyes open to track the approaching stone. He hit the far plateau feet first, the impact blasting the breath from his lungs. He dropped his shoulder into an aggressive roll, absorbing the kinetic energy and scraping his elbows raw against the rock. He skidded toward the cliff's rear edge. He drove the heavy expansion anchor clamp deep into a fissure in the basalt. The clamp locked with a sharp metallic clack. Kieran lay flat on his back, pulling desperate, ragged breaths into his lungs. He looked back across the gap. The monofilament cable snapped taut, forming a highly tensioned bridge between the stone ledges.
"Physics translate perfectly,"
Kieran wheezed, raising his thumb. They crossed the ravine in sequence, hauling themselves hand over hand across the tensioned line. They left the canyon behind and climbed into the upper jungle canopy, utilizing a dense intertwining network of massive branches as a suspended road. The temperature dropped at the higher altitude. Thick gray moss draped over the branches in long, heavy sheets, restricting visibility to a few meters. They reached the midpoint of a massive horizontal trunk when the ambush struck. The canopy above them thrashed violently. A flock of winged predators dropped from the higher branches. The creatures deployed wide, leathery membranes and thrust forward with bladed, bone-white cranial spurs. They emitted a rapid, stuttering shriek during their descent. "Contact!" Sina shouted. She unslung her standard-issue pulse rifle and snapped the stock against her shoulder. She fired a rapid burst of superheated plasma into the swarm. A pair of beasts shrieked and tumbled from the flight path, their membranes igniting. The ambient humidity overwhelmed the rifle's cooling vents. The thermal indicator flashed a warning crimson. The firearm locked its firing chamber with an electronic whine, initiating a hard override to prevent a battery detonation. Sina slammed her palm against the receiver. The weapon stayed locked. A pair of beasts folded their membranes and dove straight toward her, aiming their bladed cranial spurs directly at her chest. Sina raised her burned forearms to shield her face. Bastos stepped directly in front of her. He hoisted a massive, hardened frond, a dense slab of fibrous plant matter he had torn from a nearby stalk. He braced the thick vegetation across his forearms to form a makeshift barricade. The predator slammed into the frond. The spurs struck the thick fibers with a loud, heavy thud. Bastos grunted, driving his boots into the bark to anchor his stance against the kinetic impact. He swept the broad leaf outward in a crushing arc, knocking the predators from the air. He leveraged his low center of gravity to swing the immense weight, displaying the calculated footwork of an experienced pit fighter. A single beast slipped past the frond's edge. It slashed wildly with its bladed spur, tearing a deep, jagged laceration across Bastos's exposed shoulder. Thick, cobalt-colored blood splashed across the branch. Bastos absorbed the hit, planting his boots firmly. He dropped the frond, grabbed the creature by its throat, and hurled it off the branch into the abyss. The brutal retaliation broke the flock's attack. The remaining predators shrieked and scattered back into the upper canopy, retreating into the gray moss. Bastos stood panting. He examined his shoulder, The cut sliced through the thick dermal calluses and deep into the dense muscle beneath. The cobalt blood flowed rapidly, pooling on the bark. He swayed as his blood pressure plummeted. "Sit on the bark," Jonas commanded, dropping his pack and rushing to the bleeding man. Bastos collapsed heavily, resting his back against a vertical branch. Jonas knelt beside him, immediately applying direct pressure to the gash. He ripped the torn fabric of Bastos's uniform away to fully expose the laceration. "The spur severed a secondary artery," Jonas noted, maintaining steady compression. "The subterranean trap claimed our medkit. We require an immediate substitute for synthetic coagulants and sutures." Sina stood nearby, clutching her locked rifle. She studied the human medic as he worked. Protocol classified injured prisoners as acceptable losses during hostile terrain traversal. Regulations explicitly barred expending medical resources on a convict. Jonas discarded the regulations. He reached into his pocket and extracted a wad of gray, spongy moss he had harvested from the lower canopy. "This specific moss contains high levels of chemical astringents," Jonas explained, packing the raw fibrous plant matter directly into the open wound. "It provides a physical plug and accelerates the biological clotting response." Bastos hissed as the raw plant matter aggravated the exposed nerves, driving his fingers into the branch until the wood splintered. Jonas maintained his grip. He shrugged out of his heavy canvas jacket. He used his survival knife to slice the garment into long, sturdy strips. He wrapped the canvas tightly around Bastos's shoulder, binding the moss firmly into the laceration. He pulled the knot taut, coating his own fingers in the cobalt blood. "The bleeding has stopped," Jonas stated, wiping his hands on his pants. "Expect localized numbness. Monitor the site for severe infection." Sina processed the deliberate medical intervention the civilian had just performed on the convict. She observed Bastos, who offered Jonas a slow, respectful nod. She checked her own bandaged arms, treated hours earlier by those same human hands. The strict caste doctrine failed to map onto the events. The manual classified Bastos as disposable cargo, yet the convict had just absorbed a lethal strike to protect her. A civilian had just destroyed his own environmental gear to stabilize the prisoner. The group's mutual reliance entirely superseded the sterile logic of her training. They made camp that night inside the hollowed-out center of a massive dead tree trunk, utilizing the dry timber to block the wind. The fire burned low to conserve fuel, casting a dim orange glow over the exhausted group. Sina sat across the fire from Bastos. He rested against the wood, keeping his bandaged shoulder elevated. The low light illuminated the deep scars on his jaw. Sina leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. She had stripped off the ruined jacket of her uniform, wearing only her dirt-stained undershirt.
"Explain your intervention,"
Sina requested, lowering her volume and removing the command edge from her tone.
"Explain why you blocked the strike."
Bastos opened his eyes and looked at her.
Specify the action.
"You hauled the vines apart. You shielded me from the canopy predators,"
Sina said, dragging a stick through the dirt.
"I operate as your warden. I enforce this penal sentence. Logical self-interest dictates you allow my death."
Bastos studied the embers for a long minute.
The tribunal convicted me of extreme violence.
Bastos rumbled.
I demolished a corporate extraction facility. I crushed the overseers inside the command bunker.
He took a slow, rattling breath.
The official record strips away the preceding events. The corporate overseers pumped heavy metals into our settlement's water table to force an evacuation. My mate ingested the toxins and died. When my daughter began coughing blood, I demanded the synthesized antidotes. They refused, so I breached the clinic and took the vials. I shattered the drilling rigs to ensure they abandoned the sector.
Sina dropped the stick. She looked up, evaluating the massive gulf between the sterile penal code and the brutal industrial extortion that triggered his actions.
I committed murder, Captain,
Bastos continued, leaning his head back against the wood.
I own the blood on my hands. But I remain a father. I blocked the predators because you required a shield. I strike down the obstacle so we all survive the trek."
He reached into his pouch with his uninjured hand and extracted a scratched holodisc. He activated the lens. A flickering projection of a young girl with matching dermal calluses flickered in the air above his palm.
"I intend to survive this sentence,"
Bastos said, dropping his tone to a rough whisper.
"I intend to return to her. Achieving that requires keeping the people in this jungle alive."
Sina stared at the hologram. The young girl shared the same broad jawline as her father. Sina rubbed her sternum, confronting the memory of her own younger brother, the sibling she had promised to protect before the military draft separated them. The rigid hierarchy dissolved in the firelight, leaving a pair of exhausted people anchoring themselves to the families waiting for them. "I understand," Sina said. She addressed him directly, offering a statement of pure acknowledgement, rather than a command. Hours later, frantic, ragged breathing woke the camp. Namira huddled in the hollow tree's deepest corner. The confined space and the heavy timber walls triggered a claustrophobic spiral. She wrapped her webbed arms around her knees, convinced the dead wood was contracting to crush her. She rocked back and forth, dragging rapid, shallow breaths into her lungs. Her jaw clicked erratically as her heart rate accelerated toward a full physiological crash. A heavy footstep approached. Bastos lowered his massive frame to sit beside the glider. He positioned himself a safe distance away, leaving her an open path to the exit. Namira whimpered, pressing her spine harder against the bark.
"The walls are contracting. The air is solidifying. It is crushing my chest."
An overloaded nervous system rejected auditory logic. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the piece of basil wood Jonas had handed him the previous evening. He had spent the entire trek working the material during rest periods. He opened his massive, scarred hand, holding the finished object out to Namira. The block now formed a detailed sculpture of a soaring cliff dweller. Bastos shaped the outstretched wings with a steady hand, scoring the surface with tiny, deliberate cuts to simulate individual flight membranes. The dense basal timber felt smooth, solid, and heavily weighted. Namira paused her frantic rocking. She stared at the sculpture, then at the thick, calloused fingers that had shaped it. Tentatively, she reached out and took the wooden carving.
"The carving possesses mass,"
Bastos rumbled.
"The shadows consist only of visual tricks. They yield completely. Squeeze the timber. Feel the grain against your palm."
Namira ran her thumb over the carved wings. The dense timber provided immediate, intense tactile feedback. The heavy object served as a physical anchor, grounding her sensory input. She gripped the figurine tightly, pressing it against her sternum. She pulled a slow, deep breath into her lungs. The frantic clicking of her jaw ceased.
"Thank you,"
Namira whispered, opening her eyes. Bastos nodded. He leaned back against the timber, resting his head and settling into sleep. The morning star broke the horizon, sending harsh golden light through the canopy. The group packed their gear and began the final ascent up the steep, rocky ridge separating the jungle from the valley. The climb demanded total physical exertion. Kieran hauled Namira over the taller boulders. Sina and Jonas supported Bastos, stabilizing his injured shoulder on the steep inclines. The environment's harsh mechanics forced them into a cohesive unit, superseding the roles of captain, engineer, and convict. Kieran crested the ridge's peak first. He planted his boots, rested his hands on his knees, and blew out a long breath. "We cleared the final elevation," Kieran said, grinning through the layer of soot on his face. The remaining group joined him on the plateau. Below them, the mining settlement dominated the wide valley floor. The massive industrial sprawl consisted of gray metal hab blocks and blinding halogen floodlights. Plumes of white steam vented from the deep core drilling rigs. Heavy transport shuttles traversed the airspace between the processing towers. The halogens cut through the morning mist, illuminating the access roads. The infrastructure provided immediate medical care, high-calorie rations, and secure transport. For Sina, the settlement forced an immediate paradigm shift. The communication arrays meant she must instantly resume her command authority and enforce the penal code. She studied the corporate outpost. She looked at Bastos, who was applying pressure to his wounded shoulder. Namira ran her thumb over the wooden carving. Entering the facility required her to lock both of them inside holding cells.
"Hold your positions,"
Kieran said, tracking Sina's gaze. He turned his back to the valley and scanned the plateau. Near the eastern cliff edge, Kieran located a tall, oxidized metal spire. An automated surveyor's transmitter stood anchored to the rock, its casing severely weathered by the environment. The access panels hung loose, exposing the primary wiring harness.
"Jonas, hand me the tablet,"
Kieran ordered, jogging over to the rusted relay. He dropped to his knees and ripped the cover off the transmitter's access panel. Corroded copper and fused circuits choked the internal housing. The elemental damage severed the primary power feed. He grabbed the diagnostic cable integrated into his heavy tool belt. He drew his knife, sliced the synthetic webbing, and ripped a full meter of high-grade copper wire from the harness. He stripped the wire's ends with his teeth, spitting the plastic casing onto the rock. He jammed a single bare lead into the live battery port of Jonas's tablet and spliced the opposite end directly onto the relay's corroded power contacts.
"Bypassing the blown fuses,"
Kieran muttered, twisting the copper leads together. A sharp spark burned his thumb, but he held the connection tight.
"Booting the tablet, pinging the local emergency frequency."
The rusted spire hummed. A low vibration built up within the metal strut. The device screen flashed an active connection prompt. A harsh burst of static erupted from the relay's degraded external speaker. Kieran stepped back, holding the device out towards Sina.
"The link holds,"
Kieran said.
"You have an open channel to the settlement security headquarters."
He placed the monitor on a flat stone beside the relay, stepped back, and crossed his arms. He yielded the transmission entirely to her discretion. Sina walked toward the spire. The static hissed through the speaker, a steady, abrasive crackle. She looked down at the tablet. The screen displayed an active audio waveform. She pressed her thumb onto the transmission key.
Captain Sina, penal transport tether,
she declared, utilizing her crisp command cadence.
We have survived a catastrophic crash in the western quadrant. I request immediate medical evacuation at our current coordinates.
The static cut out. A dispatcher responded over the channel.
Copy that, Captain Sina. We possess your signal lock. Evac shuttles are launching now. Report your casualty counts and provide detainment coordinates for all surviving convicts. Security requires a sterile perimeter prior to landing."
The dispatcher recited the exact protocol that defined Sina's military career. Sina lifted her thumb off the key. She turned and evaluated the group. The crash left them battered, bleeding, and exhausted. The central database categorized them as saboteurs and thieves. But the digital records failed to capture the man who absorbed a predator's strike, the woman who crossed a collapsing precipice, or the human who cut a bulkhead open against the rising flood. Her sworn oath required her to cage them. Kieran had defined courage as outvoting the panic, falsifying a manifest, risking a court-martial, and destroying her career triggered a massive spike in her pulse. She cast the overriding vote. Sina pressed the transmission key again. She looked directly at the monitor, locking her posture into a rigid brace.
The tether sank deep into an acidic mire,
Sina reported.
The ventral hull breached upon impact, flooding the lower cell blocks. The high-security prisoners drowned. I am extracting alongside a pair of deputized civilian engineers.
The radio crackled.
"Copy that, Captain. The logs will reflect total prisoner loss. Shuttles are inbound. ETA 60 seconds.
Sina turned the tablet off. The speaker went silent, leaving only the wind sweeping across the rocks. She turned around to face the group. She dropped her arms to her sides, releasing the strict posture she had held since the crash.
The perimeter remains completely open,
Sina announced, projecting her words over the wind. She pointed toward the dense foliage leading into the mountain range to the north.
The evac shuttles will land on this exact plateau in 60 seconds. Command logs any absent personnel as deceased.
Jonas and Kieran stared at her. Sina had just committed a massive felony to forge their exit. Sina turned her back to the aliens, facing the valley to wait for the shuttles, providing them the opportunity to walk into the trees. A heavy boot scraped against the basalt behind her. Sina looked over her shoulder. Bastos sat on a large boulder directly beside the rusted relay. He had planted himself firmly on the plateau. Namira sat next to him, gripping the wooden carving. They both tracked the settlement's lights below.
The perimeter is open,
Sina repeated, furrowing her brow.
The forest offers an immediate exit. The corporation registers you as casualties.
Bastos looked up at her.
Vanishing into the forest leaves my daughter with a fugitive for a father. Walking onto that landing zone under your manifest gives me an actual chance to reach her.
He reached up and adjusted the bloody canvas wrapping his shoulder.
I broke corporate property and spilled blood. I will answer for that in a real tribunal if one ever comes. I am not dying anonymously in these trees. If you are offering a lawful way forward, I am boarding that shuttle with you.
Namira nodded, gripping the carving tighter.
The cells terrify me. Running solo through the canopy presents a higher risk. I vote to board the shuttle and trust the path you just opened.
They deliberately selected the penal colony over the wilds, anchoring their survival to the group. A hot tear tracked through the soot on Sina's cheek. She wiped it away with her thumb and offered a sharp, deeply respectful nod.
Understood,
Sina said. The roar of heavy atmospheric turbines echoed up the canyon. A pair of massive evac shuttles crested the ridge, their landing halogens illuminating the plateau as they touched down. The side doors dropped open. Security personnel deployed onto the rock, sweeping their rifles across the tree line to secure the perimeter. Medics rushed down the ramp carrying trauma kits. A senior officer approached Sina and saluted.
Captain Sina, we brought trauma teams. Ma'am, I note a pair of surviving aliens standing by the relay. Your transmission logged all prisoners as deceased.
Sina straightened her spine. Acid burns covered her cartilage plates. She reached out, took the digital manifest terminal the officer offered, and keyed her authorization.
My log stands, Lieutenant,
Sina said, projecting her voice over the turbine whine.
The prisoners drowned inside the hull.
She tapped the screen, officially bypassing the penal codes for Bastos and Namira, reclassifying their biometric profiles within the active roster.
These individuals,
Sina stated, gesturing to the massive pit fighter and the canopy glider,
operate as deputized field auxiliaries. They provided critical extraction support during the wreck.
The officer narrowed his eyes, processing the discrepancy. Standard procedure required him to accept a commanding officer's field manifest. He logged the entry, stepped back, and waved the medics forward. Jonas guided Bastos up the shuttle ramp. Kieran walked past Sina, pausing at the hatchway. Kieran looked at the captain, the shuttle's interior halogens illuminating his grease-stained face, and tapped his fist against his chest. He clearly acknowledged the heavy vote she had just cast. Sina returned the salute. She boarded the transport and strapped into the bulkhead seating. The swamp buried the strict, unyielding structure of her previous life. As the shuttle lifted off into the sky, she observed her newly assembled crew, fully prepared to defend her manifest against corporate tribunals.
Hello, my all members, subscribers, followers. I said that my channel is low original, and I have submitted some videos in English to change the motto of my channel. Please subscribe my channel, view my videos, and share in all of your friend on Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, every social media platform to send my video and view more videos. Viewers in my video. Please help me to provide some time to spend with me. Thank you to all members who can subscribe my channel and support me some time. Please view more video and entertainment video. Please help me sometime to support my channel because I am a low middle class family. Please help me.